In that passage in the letter to the Ephesians, Paul urges the Christians in a church which clearly has had some problems over recent weeks or months, urges them to walk the way of love, to walk the way in which they have been called, and to walk along the path that Jesus set before them. Just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Walk in the way of love. It's not a calm and peaceful and gentle amble through the countryside. Just as Christ loved us and sacrificed himself for us. That's the way of love that Paul is talking about. And it's the way that Paul himself had also walked. Living a life of much sacrifice, much risk, many dangers that he encountered. So he's certainly just the person to be able to say those words. Someone else who went for a walk was Elijah, and we read a little bit about his walk. But first, another more recent journey, although it was 100 years ago. It was, 101 years ago nearly, November 1911. A party of British explorers set out hoping to be the first to get to the South Pole. It hadn't been done before. They gathered a large contingent of men and they got lots of supplies. It cost a lot of money. And they went and started their trek. A large group started, and then each time they dropped some supplies at a camp along the way. The group became smaller, till in the end there were just 5 left, led by Robert Scott. They walked on, and Scott's diary records that they reached the South Pole. A disappointment. There was already a tent there and a note inside showing that a Norwegian, Roald Amundsen, and his party had arrived there just over a month earlier. They'd left. They were on their way back. And now, no doubt, somewhat dejected, this group of 5 men decided to start their return journey. It wasn't a place to stop for long, even in the middle of summer in the Antarctic as it was. They walked back, suffering from the cold and suffering with the strain of the journey and the lack of food. They couldn't eat too much because they had to carry all that they ate. They camped each night. They walked on each day, trying to cover about 16 or 17 kilometers each day. Only they got slowed down. One of their number in particular, whose name was Lawrence Oates, held them back because he was injured. Perhaps an old war wound that he'd got fighting in the Boer War. They were only able to do about 5 kilometers, about a third of what they had hoped each day. One morning, Oates said, "I'm going out. I may be gone some time." He didn't even bother to put his boots on. That was too much trouble. He walked off into the snow. And they knew that he was giving up. He was sacrificing his life so that they could walk on a bit faster. They will weaken themselves. If he was not a burden on them, perhaps they would get to the next camp and find the supplies that had been left there. Of course, he wasn't seen again. Maybe gone for some time. He wasn't even found when the party went out the following year to try and find the remains of the others who had also perished no more than a couple of days later, when a blizzard struck and they were bound to their camp and died in freezing conditions. Sad end. But from Scott's diary, we hear about the courage of this man who had left them, so that they at least might have a better chance of reaching their base. They failed. They also died. But he had actually taken an active step to help his friends. So his sacrifice is remembered very well in 20th century British history. Elijah left his servant, his friend, and walked off into the wilderness. He could, if he'd been using the same language, he could have used exactly the same words, "I may be gone some time." But he wasn't injured. He was just giving up. And that we may find strange. Thinking of Elijah, the greatest of the prophets in Jewish history, a man of tremendous stature in their faith, who left to walk into the wilderness to die. What had happened? Well, I've told the story before, and this is the moment just after the great events that had happened when Elijah had challenged the prophets of Baal on the mountain. He had challenged them to a duel, a very uneven duel. There was only one of him against 300 of them. The claim from them was that their God was the greatest. Elijah said no. But if you want to prove it, you may try. There they tried and tried and tried to prove that God would light their fire. They put sacrifices on an altar on the top of the mountain. They put oil around the altar and spent the whole day demanding that God would throw down some fire to set light to what they had placed there. Well, if it had been the other night in Tainan, there would have been plenty of fire on the mountain. The lightning would have struck in no uncertain terms, and I suspect all of us were awake and enjoying the display of lightning and the thunder. But for them it didn't happen. Elijah teased them. He said, maybe God's not listening. Maybe you need to shout a bit louder. Maybe you need to try a bit harder. They kept going. And then it was his turn. He didn't use any oil. In fact, he poured water over the whole thing. But he put up his sacrifice for God and then prayed. And the fire came down, it burnt up all the sacrifice, all the water. He had poured buckets of water around it. All the water evaporated in a cloud of steam as the smoke lifted it up to heaven. Plenty of proof there. Whose God was the powerful one. And then Elijah demanded all the people standing around watching to take these prophets of Baal down into the valley, and they were slaughtered. It's a bloody ending to it. Maybe not the kind of ending that we would endorse. It certainly wasn't pleasing to Ahab's queen, his wife Jezebel. She had been the one who had introduced this foreign religion. These were her prophets, and when she heard what had happened, she was not pleased. Well, Elijah knew she wouldn't be, and he got the message back saying that whatever befell her prophets, she wished on Elijah something even worse. It was a curse, in other words, and promise of retribution. Elijah ran for his life, and we meet him here running away. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that after this event, seeing what happened, seeing that what he had hoped for and prayed for and asked for had come true, and that God had shown himself to Elijah and all the people, you'd think that after all that, it's a really powerful sign. Elijah would have gained in courage and power, but not at all. Jezebel hadn't seen it. She didn't seem to be frightened at all. And Elijah knew that she would spare no effort in doing away with him. So he was frightened. So he ran away, and on the edge of the desert said to his servant, "You go back. I may be gone for some time." Those are the awful words. And he went, and he sat there, in the desert. He found a bush with a bit of shade to cover him, much like later on Jonah did, when he went out of Nineveh, having failed to see God's action in destroying the city. He sat there, under a bush, waiting to die. He fell asleep. God woke him up. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Of course, Elijah was running away. He was afraid of speaking to God. But God still had the care for the prophet. An angel brought a jar of water and a loaf of bread. "Get up and eat. You're on a journey now, and you'll be hungry, and you need water." So he ate and drank the water, and he had another sleep. And the angel spoke again, "Get up and eat, drink." There was more water, and there was bread. "You're going to need this, because it's a long journey." He ate and he drank again, and then returned to God's business. The journey was long, 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. And we heard that number somewhere before. Yes. The number 40 signified the 40 years of the Israelites in the wilderness on their way to the promised land after they escaped from Egypt. An escape, but a promise lying ahead. And later on, that number would represent the time that Jesus spent after, not an escape, but after his baptism. When the Spirit came upon him, Jesus didn't run away. The Spirit cast him into the wilderness. That's how it reads in the original language. It's not the Spirit just gently sent him out into the desert. The Spirit threw him out into the desert. And he was there for 40 days and 40 nights being tempted by the devil. Elijah had a journey. He had God's business to go about, and it was the journey that we know about. The journey to continue the work that he had begun, to prophesy against the evils of the king and the people who led his people. To prophesy against Jezebel and her religion. To continue an act of great bravery on God's behalf. Jesus, similarly, received courage, received strength from that time in the desert. And after those 40 days and 40 nights, having been tempted, tested in every way, Jesus returned to his ministry and began with power, walking the way of love. Walking the way of love. The bread, Jesus too had found there in the desert, available to him. Only it was petrified. Literally, it was rock. And the devil said, turn this bread, turn these stones into bread. You can do it. If you wanted to add more, you could have said, Elijah did it. Elijah found bread in the desert. You can do it. You're greater than Elijah. You know that. Temptation. Well, maybe not for us. Never felt I had the faith to do that. Never tried. Peter risked walking on the water, but Jesus was there. Do we risk turning the stones into bread? Do we risk turning things upside down? Walking the way of love? In a few days, the main part of the Olympics will be over. Paralympics will be taking place. Won't get half the attention that the first part has had. Actually, today is the final day for the main Olympics. In a few days also, the G8 leaders will be meeting. I was interested to see that 2 or 3 of the British gold medalists had signed a petition, a letter to the Prime Minister in Britain, urging him to see to it that the discussions the G8 are going to have on world food would be taken seriously. high. They've been offered all kinds of things as a result of their winning. They are already depicted on postage stamps in Britain. You can buy postage stamps, first-class stamps, with any of the Olympic gold medalists, the British Olympic gold medalists. Now, what are they doing getting involved in politics? Isn't this going to tarnish their image? Well, their answer was, we've gained high profile by winning. And now we're going to use that to help the world leaders to change the world. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, has said that he wants to see to it that by the next Olympic Games in 4 years' time, world hunger will be a thing of the past. He's said it, other people have said it, but politicians are not always very good at putting their words into action. Although they say that's what they want to do, and that they will act. Somehow it never works out. But some more people are on that side, and hoping and pushing so that this time maybe it will make a difference. In terms of what we read today, I think the readings for this week would be most appropriate. And bear in mind, the lectionary that we are using is being used by thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of churches around the world. The common lectionary, it's a list of readings we use week by week. It's a list that's been agreed by lots and lots of church leaders, although sometime in the past it's still used in many thousands of churches around the world. So just now there'll be lots and lots of preachers talking about the bread of life, talking about, will they be talking to meet the need of those who don't have enough bread? Well, let's hope and pray that that is the case, that these readings are inspiring people in churches all around the world also to put the same kind of pressure on the world leaders. It's not pushing, it's not forcing, it's what should be happening. Leaders of democratic countries should be listening to their people. Leaders of this country, leaders of countries in Asia, as well as in the West, should all be listening. And the people who should be leading the cry for justice for those who are hungry are certainly the people who walk the way of love, the way that we are being urged to walk today. The way of love, the way of the man who is God, who said, I am the bread of life. He didn't just mean some airy-fairy spiritual idea. He meant it physically, in every way. The bread of life. Life that we struggle to hang on to day by day. Life that we continue here through eating, through drinking, ensuring that we have a good diet. That's life. It's part of eternal life. It's all wrapped up in the same thing. But we take it seriously enough for ourselves, and so did Jesus. so seriously that he blessed the loaves and the fishes, and gave them out to those 5, 10, 20,000 people out there in the wilderness. The way, which is walking the way of love, certainly for Jesus, involves physical giving, sharing the loaves. So we need to think about how we can influence the world, the leaders of the world, those around us, to make that difference, so that there will not be people who are physically hungry with physically empty stomachs. It's important. It's important for people's spiritual well-being too, because people who are dying physically do not have much time to think about their spirits and their spiritual life and prayer and meditation and all the things that we take for granted in our faith that we would love to share. Our sharing, walking that way of love, involves bringing an end to war, demanding that there be an end to the violence in Syria. Wherever violence breaks out because people don't see other ways of solving their disputes. Where there's violence, there is also hunger following. Because when you've got a war, you can't put your hand to the plough in an open field. Walking the way of love demands justice, demands that we live for peace, that we bring an end to the ills, the tragedies of the world which we have created. The tragedies of war, the tragedies of not sharing the rich resources that there are. The tragedies of environmental harm that we've also been doing. All these things for the sake of God's people. And not doing them means we have to return once again penitent, offering our confession. We have not done what God has called us to do. While there are still hungry people, while there are still wars, we still have a responsibility to bring about change. However small a way we might think we can do it, while it still exists, the church, and ourselves included, has a great responsibility. So as we hear the message of Elijah, the message of Elijah returning to the right path, as we hear Paul trying to overcome the divisions, the arguments that there were in the church in Ephesus, and as we hear about Jesus feeding the people with bread and with the Word of God, we also find ourselves involved. We also have a part to play in the sharing in the life of God's kingdom, the sharing in the joy that God also gives to those who know that they are serving Him. Amen.